Shooting down the global war on drugs, two former world leaders say there's clear evidence of failure. They're calling for a fresh approach based around legalization and regulation. But can decriminalization help reduce addiction and organized crime? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry driven by violent criminal gangs and has killed hundreds of thousands of people around the world. But is the so-called war on drugs working? Two world leaders don't think so. Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and former Brazilian President Fernando Henrique Cardoso say repressive approaches to containing drugs have failed. Both men are members of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and they're calling for a new approach. In an article, they say, "We called on governments to adopt more humane and effective ways of controlling and regulating drugs. We recommended that the criminalization of drug use should be replaced by a public health approach. We also appealed for countries to carefully test models of legal regulation as a means to undermine the power of organized crime, which thrives on illicit drug trafficking." Well, let's bring in our panel now. In Washington, D.C., San-Ho Tree, director of the Drug Policy Project, which works to end the domestic and international war on drugs. From Oxford in England, we have Amanda Fielding, a drug policy reformer and founder of the Beckley Foundation. And joining this discussion on the phone from Lisbon is Manuel Pinto Coelho, president of the Association for a Drug-Free Portugal. Now, before we start, let's just run through some of the arguments for and against the legalization of drugs. So for legalization, there's the cost. Supporters say it is a colossal waste of government resources. Regulation could instead yield billions in tax revenues. It would deal a blow to organized crime and put drug dealers out of business, and cut street crime and violence related to drug trafficking and abuse. And those who are against legalization say it would create a large black market. It would lead to yet more addicts and more crime. An increase in the use of soft drugs could see users graduate to harder drugs, and drugs could more easily fall into the hands of children. So, San-Ho Tree, if I could start with you. I mean, as someone who advocates decriminalizing the use of drugs, how would all of this be implemented? I mean, how would you regulate and control the use of what are some very harmful and dangerous substances?
Well, we already have many regulatory schemes available to us around the world. We regulate all sorts of substances, some of which are more dangerous than others. And so we need to learn from those experiences. How do we keep alcohol out of the hands of minors, tobacco, prescription drugs? We have lots of regulatory schemes for all different substances.
But people would say, I mean, alcohol and cigarettes and all the rest of it are one thing, but hard drugs like crack cocaine and heroin are something on another level entirely. I mean, how would I mean, what about the argument that this sort of thing is just going to lead to people using more drugs and therefore cause more harm on society?
Well, right now we have a system where basically anyone who wants drugs can obtain drugs certainly in the United States. Maybe you have to make an extra phone call once in a while, but basically they're readily available. So we already have a system that doesn't work. What we need to find is a system that can regulate and can work.
Why do you say it doesn't work? I mean, a lot of the people who are against this are saying that drug use over a long period of time, over the last 20 years or so, has actually gone down.
You know, we have spent more than $1 trillion since President Richard Nixon first declared the war on drugs. And we have managed to fill our prisons. You know, the United States now has less than 5% of the world's population and a quarter of the planet's prisoners. We incarcerate more people than any other country on Earth. And that is largely a result of the war on drugs. So the societal costs we're paying both at home and inflicting abroad are very extreme, and I would argue that they actually cause more harm today than the drugs themselves, which is a pretty damning statement.
Amanda Fielding, how can you be sure that legalizing certain types of drugs will not lead to further crime?
I think one has to very strictly and carefully regulate the individual drugs according to their harm possibility. It's not a simple matter but it's very much better than putting this vast market, which is possibly the third biggest in the world, in the hands of criminal cartels whose interest is in optimizing drug use. Surely we can do a better job, governments of the world can do a better job at protecting the health of its citizens and security and cutting costs and recognizing human rights than the present situation, which is based on prohibition of drugs and their use, which 50 years of experimentation have shown that simply does not work, and that the collateral damage of the war on drugs is far greater than the damage caused by the drugs themselves.
But if you're going to,
we must experiment with new models.
If you're going to regulate and strictly control the use of drugs, as you say, isn't that still going to open up some sort of a black market in which drug gangs can still thrive?
There will always be some black market, like there is with cigarettes, but one can minimize the black market by an enormous degree by regulating, and that's what is now beginning to be experimented with cannabis. We should have started this long ago, experimenting what models work best. But now is the time to really get the best experts and for governments to come together with the firm intention to work out how to cut the harms created by our present policies and how to protect the health of its citizens better. And I really do think there's a lot of evidence pointing in the directions we should go. But obviously, until one tries in a cautious fashion how these models work, one has no evidence with which to categorically say which one works best. But in my opinion, the best way to go forward is to decriminalize drug use and start regulating drugs carefully with the aim of protecting health. And obviously the most obvious candidate is cannabis, and that is what Uruguay has now set out bravely to do, and states in the US, the kind of heartland of the prohibitionist model, is doing that. And it seems to have been fairly successful, because now I think more than 50% of the American population is in favor of a regulated market, certainly for medical marijuana. And I feel the damage, collateral damage in producer.
All right, so sorry to interrupt, but I just want to bring in Manuel Pinto Coelho into this now, because he's on the other side of this argument. If we look at, I mean, a lot of countries, and we're going to look into this in further detail now, have undertaken this experiment, and the argument for doing this is that it is a waste of government resources to criminalize drugs, that the legalization of drugs could produce millions in tax revenues, while at the same time putting drug dealers out of business, as we've just been hearing. Are those not compelling arguments then?
I believe that it's a very important subject, but it's a secondary subject. Most fundamental, prior to discuss that subject, most fundamental is to understand that war on drugs is obsolete, makes no sense. What makes sense is war to the causes that make that some produce, another one traffic, and a lot of them use drugs. Second, we must understand what are we talking about when we talk about decriminalization, legalization, and liberalization. We must have a clear understanding of what is first prevention and second what is treatment. If we have an understanding that prevention is not to avoid the first use, but it's only to delay the first use, we have a policy. If we have the understanding that treatment is not all the tools that we can use in order to get a drug-free life, and we have a different understanding that this is a progressive disease, chronic, reversible, progressive, and fatal. That's the only thing that we, people who take care of the people that problems, the only thing that we can do is to substitute one drug, giving another one. Then we have the policy is other. Then, first of all, we must have beginning, what I said before, we must have a clear understanding what is prevention and what is treatment.
Let's delve into this a little bit more now and talk a little bit more about the decriminalization. The calls for the decriminalization of drugs are growing stronger around the world, as we've been hearing. Portugal, where Manuel Pinto Coelho joins us from, is seen as a pioneer. It decriminalized drug use 12 years ago, putting possession of a small amount of drugs on a par with illegal parking. The U.S. states of Colorado and Washington have legalized the recreational use of cannabis for those over 21. In South America, Chile, Ecuador and Colombia have ruled that the possession of drugs for personal use is no longer a crime. And Uruguay is considering a bill which would see the government growing and selling marijuana for as little as $1 a gram.
Today in Uruguay, there are somewhere between 120 and 130,000 marijuana users who one way or another have a systematic relationship with the illegal market. By that I mean criminal organizations which unscrupulously profit in the system, and starting with the passing of the law and it being put into place, it will progressively capture more of some of the most important parts of the black market.
Bueno, no es que sea un proyecto malo, es desastroso.
It's not that it is a bad bill, it's disastrous. It is a bill that was basically built over the following rationale. We have a marijuana use problem at a certain level in some populations, so to minimize this problem, we're going to compete with the drug dealers.
All right, Manuel Pinto Coelho, as someone who was involved in the Portugal experiment, why do you think it has failed?
Okay, we can discuss ideas. We cannot never discuss facts. And the fact is that crack cocaine rose suddenly in Portugal. Heroin use rose in Portugal. Since the last 10 years, we assist to a rise of 70% of drug prevalence. I have here the EMCDDA report of 2011. EMCDDA, the president of EMCDDA, European Monitoring Center of Drug and Drug Addiction, is the same person that leads the Portuguese Drug Institute. And what is written in page 24 in the 2011 report of EMCDDA is, I say, Portugal's drug policy, as with all other national drug policies, is unlikely to be a magic bullet. The country still has high levels of problem drug use and HIV infection and does not show specific developments in its drug situation that would clearly distinguish it from other European countries that have a different policy. Then it's a fallacy trying to believe that Portugal, since decriminalizing, brought to decriminalize drugs in 2001, has more healthy people and less prevalence of use of the different drugs.
All right.
No,
let's put some of that. Let's put some of that back then. Let's put some of that back then to Sanho Tree. I mean, the argument is that in Portugal this hasn't worked, and there simply is not a convincing case for decriminalization here.
Well, sorry, I missed a little bit of the audio, but my understanding is the Portuguese model has actually worked. That, you know, they're going through austerity, there are budget cuts and that sort of thing. But in fact, the process of not criminalizing all these people also saves the society a great deal of money as well. I think the great myth of prohibition is that, you know, prohibition doesn't mean we control drugs. It means we give up the right to control these drugs, and that the people who then control this economy are by definition criminals and very often organized crime. That to me is the bottom line.
But if it's if it's going to lead to more people using drugs, then how is that a good thing?
Well, we already have decriminalization models in many states where you don't have this massive increase in drug use or anything. Certainly in California and a lot of western states in the United States, they've had medical marijuana for many years now. And let me just put it this way, it's not difficult to get a doctor's note recommending medical marijuana. The sky hasn't fallen the way the drug warriors have predicted for years that this would happen in California and other places. In fact, life goes on pretty much as normal. The difference is that that money is not going into the black market, not going to support cartels. It is being taxed and being redirected back into state coffers, into prevention and treatment, and it is made for a much safer and better environment overall. I don't see whose interest it is to drive this economy back underground again and to fill the pockets of criminal enterprises. That doesn't benefit society in any way.
Amanda Fielding, how do you look at these various experiments with trying to decriminalize drugs? Is the jury still out on this, or do you think that there's reason to look for success here?
I think basically the countries which have decriminalised, like Portugal, Czech Republic and the Netherlands, have been proved successful. They've got a much lower problem use level than countries like the UK and the US. They've got much lower heroin use. Death from drugs.
I don't know if you heard Manuel Pinto there earlier, but he said that the drug use. He was saying the drug use has actually increased quite markedly in Portugal over the last few years.
But if use of cannabis increases, it has been shown that it can go with a decrease of alcohol. And I think what we should worry about is not the use per se, but the problem use. And that's the thing which has dropped in the Portuguese model, because it's much easier to access treatment if people want it. And we've just done a report on the cost-benefit analysis of a regulated and taxed market in the UK. And that shows many benefits, including economic benefit to the government of over £1 billion, which can then be directed towards health and education. I think it's a mistake to think that the government can't do a better job of controlling and protecting people's health than can criminal cartels. And actually, this 350 billion or whatever it is in the illegal market is like a cancer in the world. It's making certain countries, particularly the producer transit ones, war zones. And 50 years has shown you cannot stop the desire of people to alter their consciousness. And where there's a demand, there will always be a market. So it's basically simplistic to think that we can eradicate drugs. We have to learn how to regulate them in order to minimize the harms.
Let's put that back to Manuel then. Are we looking at the wrong statistics here? I mean, you cited these statistics in Portugal of increased drug use, but is it all just about the drug use itself? I mean, as we've heard there, people are still going to use these drugs, whether you decriminalize them or not. And if fewer police resources and the law courts and so on are spending less time focusing on catching drug users and drug dealers and so on, and those resources are used for other benefits for the good of society, then that's surely a plus, isn't it?
The problem is with our law that allows people to handle drugs. Doesn't matter if it is crack cocaine or cannabis or hashish or heroin. Until 10 days of use, you are inviting people to use drugs. Because for personal use, you only need for 1 day or 2 days. If you go in for a weekend, you need maybe for 3 days. But if you are allowed to carry drugs until 10 days, government is inviting people to use them. Then it's a culture of intoxication. And it's, the young people is very attentive, very aware to the signs they get from the culture where they are living with. Then what we need in Portugal or some place in China or in Japan and all over the world, what we need is a clear sign that is not with drugs, that people can achieve a better future. And people who are already caught by drug problems, they must believe that if they want to stop them, they can do that. Rehab is possible. Rehab is possible. And if we listen that we have a disease, chronic,
what about
you never get rid of them.
What about this moral argument, Sanho Tree, that if you legalize drugs, the government and society is simply sending the wrong signal to people that it's okay to take these kind of drugs with all of the harmful effects that it has on health, that it's sending the wrong message to drug users and potential future drug users?
Well, what message are we currently sending to people? That, if you believe that drug abuse and addiction is a public health issue, for what other health conditions do we use police, prosecutors, and prisons as the primary means of making people better? Let's give another analogy. We all agree that anorexia is a terrible disease. It kills many people every year, particularly young women. Why don't we criminalize anorexia? Why don't we have weight courts and put people into prison if they are fussy eaters? People would say that's crazy. You should have doctors in charge of public health issues, not law enforcement. That's the fundamental paradigm shift we're looking at here. It makes about as much sense to criminalize this as to cure clinical depression with a baseball bat. You know, smile and be happy or I'll beat you again. We cannot coerce people into being healthy.
But again, people who on the other side of this would argue that taking drugs is a conscious decision that you take, which is a little bit more different to the argument that you use of anorexia.
For some people, they do engage in problematic drug use. The vast majority of people who experiment or use drugs recreationally, occasionally, are not problematic users. I see no benefit in putting these people behind bars to send a message to other people. For those who are problematic users, we need a different series of responses to them rather than criminalization. It doesn't make sense to punish people for being ill.
Amanda Fielding, what's your view on the morality argument, that the idea that when society and the government just takes themselves out of all of this and decriminalizes it, it's in effect just kind of throwing your hands up and giving up?
I totally don't agree. I think you have to look at the last 50 years. People have taken very little notice of the official message. The use of drugs has increased fantastically since the 1961 convention came in, when it was a minor occupation. And you also have to remember that alcohol and tobacco are vastly more damaging to the health and vastly more costly to society than the use of illegal drugs. And I think making use of substances illegal is completely the wrong way about it. We want to protect the health of the young in every way we can, and people who get patterns of misuse should be treated as a health issue. But meanwhile, we need to educate young people not to use drugs when they're young, because it's not a good idea. And I think one must remember that people aren't such fools. Like the education messages through on tobacco have had a lot of effect. And if the governments came truthful about drugs, I mean, millions of people take drugs. I think they reckon 250 million, the UN, in the world. And most of those people take it because they have benefits from them. They enjoy them, maybe. And I don't think we should live in a state where the state controls the consciousness of people. Obviously, if people do a crime other than using the substance, then that has to be taken care of. But just the mere fact of using a drug such as cannabis should not be a crime. And the trouble of it being criminal is it gives rise to terrible discrimination. There's absolutely no doubt that coloured people are vastly more likely to be arrested and go to prison than white people. And it's a tool of discrimination. To go to prison can ruin your life chances, and it's completely wrong to spend the vast majority of the money being spent by the taxpayer around the world on catching people and incarcerating them. It's just not the right approach. We should be spending it on the protection of health and security and education and treatment and harm reduction.
Sanho, what's your response to some of that then?
I think we need to have a clear definition of what we mean by prohibition, by criminalization, because what this is doing is creating a vast black market where it should not exist. When we're talking about things like cannabis, cocaine, heroin, these are minimally processed agricultural commodities that are very simple to produce and cost, in real terms, pennies per dose. And yet, because we have policies of prohibition and high demand around the world, we create an astronomical price support for drug traffickers. And this is completely unnecessary. necessary. This is a self-inflicted wound that we have imposed upon ourselves. And as our politicians try to crack down and be tougher on drugs, it creates then a greater risk premium that drug traffickers can charge each time they move these drugs. So we're building in this price support that should not exist for drug traffickers.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Fascinating discussion, but we'll have to wait and see how all of this plays out. For the moment, thank you to all three of my guests, Sanho Tree and Amanda Fielding, and on the phone from Lisbon, Manuel Pinto Coelho. And don't forget, you can find this program and many more at aljazeera.com. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story. I'm Hazem Seeker. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.